Okay, dear colleagues, dear friends, it's my great pleasure to welcome everybody at the continuation of our event series called Armed Democracy, which will be running till the end of this week. And I'm really happy to welcome today Jan-Werner Müller. Thank you so much that you kindly agreed to take part in our program. My name is Vasyl Cherepanyn. I represent Visual Culture Research Center and the Kyiv Biennial. And first of all, traditionally, I have to express our deep gratitude to the Ukrainian military, thanks to which this whole series and this event in particular became possible, because without them, we in Ukraine wouldn't be able just to sit even here. So I also have to tell that this Armed Democracy program series, which will go till the 9th of July, has been conceived by the Kyiv Biennial and Biennale Warsaw from the East Europe Biennial Alliance. And it is taking place within the framework of the second edition of the Warsaw Biennial that is still on show these days till mid-July. So those in Warsaw, I welcome you to visit the biennial locations. And it is the first part of the whole program that was organized by the East Europe Biennial Alliance. And after this Armed Democracy series, there will be a follow-up taking place in Prague within the second edition of the Prague Biennial, also in Kassel within Documenta 15, and later in September in Riga within the next edition of the Survival Kit Festival in Riga. So also a short technical note to our audience. This event is being live streamed on the Facebook page and YouTube channel of Biennale Warsaw. So those who are watching this over there, I'm encouraging you to leave your comments and questions on the Facebook chat or YouTube chat. And then after the presentation itself, we will have a round of Q&A, and I will try to voice all the questions to our renowned speaker tonight. So thank you so much again, Jan-Werner, for kindly joining us today. Jan-Werner Müller is a professor of social sciences and politics at Princeton University. He works mainly in democratic theory and the history of modern political thought. He also has research interests in the relationship between architecture and politics, as well as the normative implications of the current structural transformations of the public sphere. Just to name some of his important books, his publications include Constitutional Patriotism of 2007, Contesting Democracy, Political Ideas in 20th Century Europe of 2011, and What is Populism of 2016, which has been translated into more than 20 languages. And his last book, which appeared last year, is titled Democracy Rules. And today's talk is called On Militant Democracy, and somehow it's, of course, very much connected to the general title of this program series, Armed Democracy. And this is basically a notion which we will explore today, somehow is dedicated to the need to defend democracy in front of the different threats from the side of authoritarian regimes. So thank you so much again, Jan-Werner, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vasyl, for the kind introduction. And let me also emphasize that it's a real honor to speak in the program that you've put together this spring under obviously incredibly difficult circumstances. So militant democracy is not exactly a very familiar expression in the English language. Not that this is in and of itself terribly interesting, but I may point out that about a dozen years ago, I organized a small conference with the title Militant Democracy. And a number of colleagues came to me and said, what do you mean? What is this? What is militant democracy? Do you mean military democracy? Is this about the relationship between the military and democracy? So for some people, there seems to be a link to the overall theme of the program this summer, armed democracy. But I hasten to add that it's not quite the same thing. Militant democracy, in essence, responds to the problem, the challenge of political actors, and in particular political associations, which appear to be using the instruments of democracy in order to abolish democracy itself. In other words, it refers to actors and associations which are not doing anything that is already prohibited by the criminal law. So this is not the same as military attack from the outside. This is not the same as terrorism. This is basically what historians would be familiar with as the classic conundrum of the Weimar Republic. Basically, actors and associations which appear to be working within democratic structures in order to get rid of democracy itself. Many people in this discussion, for better or for worse, probably rather for the worse, tend to invoke two famous pronouncements from Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, who at one point said, well, it shall always remain one of the greatest jokes that democracy furnished us, the Nazis, with the instruments, with the tools to destroy democracy from within. And then later on, he also, and this is a less well-known quote, he also pointed out that if only a few of us had been taken out of the political game early on, then, Nazism could never have succeeded, the Third Reich would never have happened, and so on. So it's this particular issue that theories of militant democracy are concerned with. Threats to democracy from within democracy itself. I'll say a few more words about the history of this concept in just a moment, but as you can imagine, for at least a number of years, there really wasn't much of a discussion around these issues, because in plenty of countries, as I hardly probably need to remind this audience, there was a kind of expectation that once you had achieved something that political scientists would refer to as a consolidated democracy, there really was no way back. There really was no way that democracies could possibly be destroyed from within. As everybody in this audience, I'm sure, knows, today in 2022, things look rather different. Of course, there has been what is widely referred to as the global rise of right-wing populism. Populists, I would say, are generally not characterized by opting for a strategy of political violence or anything of the sort. On the contrary, quite often they claim that they are actually the more authentic, the real Democrats, as opposed to liberals and assorted other supposedly corrupt elites. Less obviously, perhaps, but surely also something that nobody in Poland needs special reminders about. All of a sudden, we've also had a more particular challenge of countries, or to be more precise, governments within the European Union seemingly eroding democracies, their own democracies from within, and the European Union all of a sudden being confronted with the question of what to do in cases which clearly nobody had expected in the course of the 1990s. Nobody had really expected pretty much until, to put it bluntly, Viktor Orban came to power in 2010 for the second time and promptly started to dismantle not just, as is often put, the rule of law, but also democracy itself. So all of a sudden, in addition to this more general question about the destruction of democracy from within, there was a more particular European question about whether the supranational polity of the European Union had the instruments, and of course also not least had the political will to somehow defend democracy against those who seem to be bent on destroying it from within. Now, all along, the very concept of militant democracy has been shadowed by a whole range of, shall we say, normative doubts, a whole range of voices who've been saying, look, this might be an inherently contradictory enterprise. It might be inherently paradoxical to opt for a strategy of defending democracy against its supposed enemies through basically restricting democracy itself. Because that ultimately is what at least the standard toolkit of militant democracy tends to come down to. It comes down to things like party bans. It comes down to other restrictions on fundamental political rights. So restrictions on free assembly, for instance, restrictions on free speech, restrictions on running for office, even in some cases, restrictions on the right to vote. And as you can imagine, plenty of people have said, look, once you start doing these kinds of things, once you start to ban parties which have done nothing criminal, which are not involved in violence, which are not doing anything that is, generally prohibited, you've already destroyed democracy yourself. In the process of supposedly saving democracy, you yourself are actually dismantling it. One of the most egregious, although it's not quite so obvious as an example, one of the most egregious examples, though, of this for many people comes from Algeria in the early 90s, where some of you may remember, it looked like in the second round of the elections, what was widely referred to as an Islamist party was going to come to power, a party that, in the eyes of many people, had essentially said, once we're in power, we're going to get rid of democracy. So before the second round could even happen, the military stepped in and abolished democracy altogether. So this is an extreme version of the worry of, well, let's save democracy by essentially destroying democracy. And that worry has been around for a long time. Already in the 1920s, the Austrian jurist Hans Kelsen, quite possibly the greatest jurist of the 20th century, was adamant in saying, look, you got to go down with the ship. If people don't want democracy anymore, if they're willing to opt for actors and parties that are basically saying very openly that they want to be done with democracy, then there's no way of saving it. There's no democracy without Democrats. There's no way of acting against the people themselves if the people themselves ultimately really don't want democracy anymore. As some of you may recognize, this very spring, a discussion somewhat along these lines played out. As you will know, a whole range of parties in Ukraine have been banned recently. And one of the responses on a Telegram channel to this came from no one less than Dmitry Medvedev, who pointed out, oh, look, this is how Ukraine is now building democracy, by basically banning all the opposition parties. Keep it up, keep it going. That was a version of the worry that, okay, by trying to protect democracy, in this case, or so the official justification went, by basically banning parties that are colluding with Moscow, that are pro-Putin, pro-Russia, and so on, by basically banning opposition parties in the name of saving democracy, you are actually already destroying democracy itself. That's the big question which hangs over this whole concept, and which in the eyes of some critics for sure is basically fatal to the whole approach. Now, the question I want to ask is whether that worry is ultimately justified, or whether one couldn't think of a more judicious use of the militant democratic toolkit in the face of some of the challenges to democracies in the early 21st century, both at the national level, but also at the supranational level. And in order to do so, if I may, I want to offer you 3 brief chapters. First of all, I want to go a little bit back into the history of the concept. As you all will remember, Nietzsche famously said, only that which has no history can be defined. So we can't really take some aseptic, sterile definition of this whole idea off the shelf. It is, as always, important to understand where a particular political idea is coming from, what particular associations it may have carried with itself, who was employing it for which purposes, what legacy it has, and so on and so forth. Then in the second chapter, I want to ask more analytically, if you like, some of the main questions that those who are at all inclined to use militant democracy, I think necessarily have to answer. And in particular, I want to address the issue, what kind of criteria could possibly justify restricting somebody's fundamental political rights in a democracy? And then also related to that, who could possibly decide which institution is in a good position to make that kind of call? And then lastly, in a very brief chapter, I want to offer not a clear-cut conclusion, because this is simply not an issue where I think we're helping ourselves if we have a sort of binary yes, no, should have it, should not have it kind of answer, but basically try to give a relatively nuanced account of what factors to bear in mind if one at all wants to use it, and then hopefully also enter into a discussion with at least some of you based on particular experiences, particular thoughts that might help us in advancing our thinking about this genuinely complicated, genuinely difficult question. So first chapter, very briefly, what is the history of militant democracy? Well, the term itself was first used by, as it happens, an exile, namely the German initially jurist, later on political scientist, Karl Löwenstein, a Jewish legal theorist who had to leave Germany in the 1930s, went to the United States, started publishing a number of articles, including 2 articles in the American Political Science Review, probably the most influential articles which have ever been published in this otherwise relatively obscure journal, where in the mid-1930s, he started to say, look, if one takes a close look at the situation in Europe today, one sees that time and time again, fascist parties have come to power by using the very rights with which democracies have furnished them. And Löwenstein was very clear-cut in saying, we have to, as he put it, fight fire with fire. If they are going in a more restrictive way, the fascists, we also have to go in a more restrictive way. So he openly said, parties might have to be banned, demonstrations might have to be banned, there might be all kinds of other measures, such as creating what he called a kind of political police, which should investigate particular associations to determine whether they truly posed a threat to democracy or not. That was the first time that this kind of toolkit was really put out in a more systematic manner. It's important for how the story develops later on to emphasize that Löwenstein himself explicitly said that fascism was not really an ideology. It, according to him, didn't really contain any ideas. It was, as he put it, purely a form of emotionalism. And as you can hopefully see, plenty of not atypical, culturally pessimistic assumptions about the masses from the 19th century, but also the first half of the 20th century, kind of tended to be in the background of this analysis. In other words, he didn't have much faith in basically trying to engage individual citizens about democratic ideas. He was so worried that everybody is always, ready to be seduced by the great demagogue, is ready to fall for, false fascist promises, that basically only a relatively blunt legal intervention, namely rights restrictions for particular individuals and particular associations, could possibly work. Now, this very idea is then picked up in the post-war period by the country from which Löwenstein had to emigrate, namely Germany, or more particularly West Germany, where the Constitutional Court in the course of the 1950s basically adopts this whole framework and starts to ban parties. And in particular, it first bans what, for all intents and purposes, is a party that continues National Socialism, and then also bans the Communist Party later on in the 1950s. There are other examples in other parts of Europe at the time, but this is the case where both the justification is most clear-cut. This is also the case where the jurists in question very openly say it doesn't matter whether these kinds of parties have an actual chance of coming to power. It's enough that they exhibit a clear will to overthrow democracy. That's enough of a justification to say we got to take these kinds of actors out of the political game at the very beginning. Now, plenty of critics at the time and later on were critical of this development because, in line with what they saw as a typical Cold War totalitarian imaginary, where you basically tended to equate Nazism and communism, it seemed that the thing that really mattered at the time was basically to take out the left side and not the right side, because in many countries, the right side, according to many observers, didn't really pose that much of a challenge anymore. And problematically for these critics, it was not just obvious Stalinists, but it was a much wider range of actors, often people who were not in any way exhibiting any sympathy to Moscow, but who were simply more radical leftists, who were also basically hit by militant measures of one sort or another. So some people in Germany, for instance, can still remember a time in the 1970s when, if you wanted to become a sports teacher in school, but a civil servant, you were asked questions about your politics. And, had you ever supported, a particularly radical left-wing party? So in the eyes of critics, this whole militant approach eventually might always become something like McCarthyism of one sort or another. So that takes us pretty much up to the present. As I already said, for many years there wasn't much of a discussion about this, certainly not in the English-speaking world. If you had gone to the UK or the US 10 years ago and said, I'm interested in talking about militant democracy, people would not have had any idea what you were talking about. Probably most people would have said, look, we don't ban political parties. I mean, this is something that over-anxious continental Europeans might do on the basis of their history, but we basically trust the political process to work this out by itself. We have faith in politics. We have faith that dangerous actors will eventually be marginalized in one form or another. Of course, as always, it helps to forget one's own history, especially in the United States. Of course, one could have easily replied, well, look, think back to McCarthyism. Many people were truly harmed by this. It's true that the Communist Party of the USA was never quite outlawed, even though there was a law that tried to do this in ways that were similar to developments in Europe, but there was at least somewhat of a history there as well. But it was largely forgotten later on. And in a certain, I dare say, relatively smug way, many people in the English-speaking world simply said, look, we just don't have these. We just don't have these problems. Well, as we all know, now we do have these problems. And we have very real questions about should, for instance, Republican politicians who appear to have openly supported the January 6th insurrection, should they be banned from running for Congress again or not? All of a sudden, that has become a very live discussion in ways that few people could have imagined 10 years ago. So here we are. We have the discussion on our hands, and that prompts, I think, here's my second chapter, a more distant and somewhat more abstract, I'm afraid to say, a more analytical set of questions, namely, what should be the criteria for taking such drastic measures as reducing somebody's fundamental political rights? Now, I already hinted at what for a long time in the German case was seen as the plausible answer. Namely, it was enough to exhibit what the Constitutional Court referred to as a fighting attitude. Somebody who, doesn't just sort of abstractly talk about, oh, monarchy would be better than democracy, or isn't there something to be said for, a certain kind of authoritarianism because, authoritarians can act more quickly. I mean, these sorts of arguments. It wasn't enough to have these sort of discussions in the abstract. One needed to display a fighting attitude in actually opposing democracy. But note that there was no concern with the empirical likelihood of actually making it into power. So if you had this fighting attitude, it was enough. And you could be a very, very marginal player. But if you somehow seem to display, a set of activities, a kind of will to really change the political world in an anti-democratic action, that was enough to basically trigger banning. In many other contexts, including actually for a couple of years more recently, the discussion has moved away from such a relatively clear-cut criterion. At the European level, which is to say at the level of the European Court of Human Rights, there seems to have emerged a somewhat weaker criterion, a criterion that actually does stress the empirical likelihood of anti-democratic actors actually coming to power. Such that basically the thought is that, look, if these are very, very marginal actors, and if they're not engaging in anything that is already covered by criminal law, so again, no violence, nothing that would already be illegal anyway. If they're only doing forms of politics that seem to agitate against democracy, they should be left alone. And those who kind of favor this approach sometimes back it up with a further argument that they say, look, it's important that people have a chance to articulate their discontent with the democratic system. If you immediately shut everything down, if you say, no, we're going to restrict your free speech, we're going to restrict your ability to form a political association, then we're never going to hear about certain problems. We don't really understand what's happening in society. This is probably going to go underground. It might actually turn violent much more quickly than it might in other scenarios. So let's sort of give these things some space, and only if such parties were to become much bigger do we seriously think about restricting people's fundamental rights. Now, as some of you probably have already thought, this seems to be a somewhat unstable position to hold. First of all, note that it relies on the somewhat comforting thought that, when people say certain things, even if the things they say sound, let's say, horribly racist, it's never really racism. It's really unemployment, or it's discontent with something else. So the idea, the kind of quasi-therapeutic approach that says, oh yeah, let people talk, but we already know that their real problems are different, and we need to let them talk, because then we're going to find out what really bothers them, and then we're going to sort of fix these underlying problems, usually assumed to be economic, might not always be empirically wrong. But the assumption, of course, can be questioned. And second of all, perhaps this is a little bit too sanguine about the cost of racist talk, even if the racist talk doesn't immediately translate into violence. Because even if some of these actors look like they're marginal, or they have no chance of coming to power, in a local context, it can still have disastrous consequences for those who are more immediately exposed, let's say, to certain forms of racist talk. Because also what they're getting in a certain sense in countries where in theory such speech could be restricted or militant democracy could be deployed. But the message these actors are getting is the state ultimately thinks this is okay. This can be tolerated. We can put up with this. So that's one complication with this position. The other complication is that it seems somewhat peculiar, at least, to say, okay, when a party is small, we basically tolerate it, even if it seems to have a pretty clear-cut anti-democratic program. But when it actually gathers more support, and it has, take your pick, 20% support or 30% support, then we're going to ban it. That seems very peculiar, because if the program was unacceptable all along, why didn't you ban it when it was small? Why did you give it a chance to basically gather support, convince people of this program, such that, at this stage, you have a much bigger problem on your hands. You have potentially maybe even a civil war on your hands, because 30% of the population are not simply going to say, oh, fine, our favorite political party all of a sudden disappears from the ballot. So again, there are genuinely difficult questions here of which criteria would possibly be appropriate if you think this is at all an acceptable or even promising approach to take in terms of defending democracy. The other question I briefly want to bring up is about institutions. So which institution, which set of actors are best placed to make the call as to whether somebody's fundamental political rights, again, to form a party, to run for office, even to, in some cases, articulate their political views, let's say on the internet. Under which conditions might it possibly be okay to do this? And if you think it's okay to do this under some conditions, who should basically make the decision? Now, as many of you know, the standard answer to this has been, it must be courts. It cannot possibly be more directly political actors. It cannot be a president. It cannot be a government. It cannot be other political parties, because then basically other political parties have too much of an incentive, too much of a temptation to basically start outlawing their competitors. And that can't possibly be right in a well-functioning democracy. Again, at the European level, if you look at the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights and others, it's very clear that this is basically the answer. It has to be courts. It cannot be anybody else. But again, this gives rise to two possible criticisms. Number one, in at least some countries, parties actually remain involved after all. And that might not always be such a bad thing. In at least some countries, it actually has to be political parties who basically bring a case to a court. Courts, of course, usually cannot take the initiative themselves. Somebody has to register a complaint. Somebody has to trigger the process. And at least in some models of militant democracy, it is actually a sitting government or a parliament which initiates the process. And even though I said a minute ago that this is in principle problematic, in certain contexts, it might actually be not such a bad thing. Why? Because parties themselves are also conscious of not wanting to look like they're simply outlawing their competitors. And at least sometimes they might decide, look, we can do this without courts. We can do this without prohibitions. We can show the strength of our democracy by basically going after these prima facie anti-democratic and dangerous actors, and we're going to defeat them politically in elections. We're going to talk to them. We're going to talk against them. We are going to convince citizens that this is dangerous. And we don't want this to look like, oh, here are these potentially huge parties, and we kind of suppress them with legal means. And if you look at the one country in a wider European context where parties are constantly banned, that's Turkey. Many people have said, look, you can overdo party banning if it becomes almost automatic. So, you say something about the Kurds in Turkey in your party program, boom, the next day you're banned, and there is no political space for discussing certain issues. And for many people, that sort of confirms that this kind of militant democracy is probably a bad thing. But if the process isn't quite as automatic, if courts don't sort of, are always automatically basically stepping in to restrict fundamental rights, if there is more of a process where parties make a judgment call whether they should bring a case or not, maybe in certain ways that can be a good thing. So that's one complication in this regard. The other issue I briefly want to bring up, and it's something that has sort of played an increasingly important role in scholarly debates about this issue, is that in the eyes of some critics, basically leaving the defense of democracy to courts is just horribly elitist, or in certain ways very technocratic. So you don't basically trust the people themselves to save democracy. You hand it to a number of wise, probably in all likelihood wise men for the most part, who will kind of do the job, for the rest of the citizenry. And that's a criticism that you might say on one level is prima facie not a crazy thing to say. On another level, though, you might say, well, look, the people themselves defending democracy and using the machinery of militant democracy are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Civil society is left free to defend democracy through demonstrations, through putting pressure on anti-democratic actors, all by themselves. Nothing precludes from people themselves articulating their willingness to defend democracy against anti-democratic actors. And this, you might say, actually in many countries happens all the time. If far-right parties, have a demonstration, there are usually plenty of protesters who say, look, there are many more of us around here. Look, don't assume that this is the silent majority. This is actually a loud minority, and the real majority is over here and holds very different views and is willing to defend democracy in all kinds of ways. Okay, let me again close a chapter which raised more questions than provided answers, and in the same possibly quite frustrating manner, proceed to my last set of remarks, which on the one hand will just very briefly touch on the whole question of supranational militant democracy, and then lastly, instead of a clear-cut conclusion, basically add yet another complication in this area of under which conditions militant democracy might possibly make sense. So one word briefly on the supranational dimension of all this, which again, for a long time, basically was in the eyes of many Europeans a total non-issue. Nobody expected that countries which had joined the European Union could possibly revert to any form of autocracy. Now, as everybody in this audience will know, we're in a situation where we have two countries in the European Union where this has become, a very live discussion. Slovenia seemed to be on the same path up until earlier this year. Now, when you think about the famous Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union, you might say in a certain way it's actually a classic example of militant democracy. Because what does that famous article actually do? It basically doesn't punish anybody in any direct sense. It, if anything, restricts a government's fundamental rights, but without actually intervening in the country itself. So it basically says, if you're in breach of fundamental European values, such as democracy and the rule of law, you no longer have a voice in the council, but other than that, nothing, at least for the moment, is going to happen. So it's exactly the logic of rights restrictions, obviously with a view to influencing that government and having that government say, okay, all right, we get it. We will mend our ways. We will somehow come into compliance. We will somehow observe, European values and so on. But at a supranational national level, it is actually precisely the logic of militant democracy. And importantly, it also basically doesn't mean anything like a permanent banning of particular actors. It makes it conditional and says, look, if you change, we change, and we let you back into the club. And it's given the recent discussion, especially about the release of funds to Poland, it's maybe worth pointing out that it's a really different logic from the logic of financial sanctions. That's on one level much less directly political. It's much less about fundamental rights restrictions. And in a certain way, it's much more of an intervention inside the country itself that says, look, we are going to create a situation where hopefully there's enough pressure on a particular government to change its ways, mend its ways, and come into compliance with European values. So militant democracy also matters at this level, but alas, that's not to say that some of the questions and issues I raised earlier on, are necessarily any easier at that level. Now, having left you already with more questions than answers, in the hope of having an interesting discussion later on, let me bring in one last difficulty, which perhaps is worth flagging. And again, it's a kind of paradox. And it's a paradox that I think was first articulated by the German jurist Christoph Müller, who pointed out that those countries which can have and effectively use the toolkit of militant democracy, so countries which really succeed in banning anti-democratic political parties and basically have that accepted as a legitimate decision, that countries like that probably don't really need militant democracy. Whereas countries that actually would need militant democracy cannot have it. Let me elaborate on that thought for just one more minute. What he's basically trying to say is that if West Germany in the 1950s had not banned the de facto neo-Nazi party and had not banned the Communist Party, it probably would have turned out okay as well. It probably would have become a consolidated democracy, even if the machinery of party bans had not been available. And the very fact that it was available, in a sense, was an indication that there was in any case a broad-based consensus around democratic principles. Now, in countries where you have very strong and large anti-democratic forces, it's very unlikely that people are going to agree on the toolkit of militant democracy. Even in countries which are, let's just say, very polarized. Think of the contemporary United States, where some people might say, well, look, militant democracy is damn necessary. We have somebody who might run for president again and who is very clearly an anti-democratic actor. It will be very important to restrict Trump's fundamental rights and ban him from running for office again. But given how polarized the country already is, you basically can't use these kinds of tools. So this is the paradox. Where you can have the tools, you don't really need the tools. And where you would need the tools, you don't have the overall conditions to really basically generate and successfully employ the toolkit. Now, that might seem a relatively pessimistic conclusion, except it wasn't really meant to be the conclusion. It was meant to be just yet one more complication on, as I said, a genuinely complicated and challenging area in political theory, in jurisprudence, and with regard to what I think many of us would agree is an incredibly urgent question at the beginning of the 21st century. Let me thank you for your attention up until this point. I look forward to what I hope will be a lively discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jan-Werner. I'm also, again, reminding our audience that you can leave your questions or comments on YouTube chat or on Facebook page, and I will also try to voice them to our speaker. I have a question in this regard because, first of all, it seems like, especially when we take the Western context, that this kind of gesture of using these prohibition tools, as you described it, can basically work out only when you have kind of a situation when the ruling force in a given country is basically a democratic or presumably democratic one. So in that case, it is possible to approach other parties or other agents in the political field in order to restrict them. But what can be done if we take only like one country dimension, right? Because you also in the third point you also mentioned this supranational level, but it somehow can be applicable to the situation in which you still can sort of enjoy this privilege of having a ruling party which is more or less following the democratic behavior and respective rules. But when it comes to, for instance, like in Hungary, well, Poland now is a bit different example, but to a certain extent it also works in that case, that what can be done if the party from the very beginning somehow proclaiming its democratic stance somehow gets into the position of power and then afterwards basically changes the whole set of rules and the whole game, democratic game, in a way that it basically you cannot even accuse that respective party in doing so, because it basically doesn't break the law officially, right? You can only somehow observe this anti-democratic stance only as an outcome of these activities. So what can be here kind of a preemptive gesture, because it somehow seems that we are in an open field and like we have to sort of to work out our optics in a way so to trace those enemies where in the situation where there are no traces at all. So what kind of preemptive gestures are needed here in order to understand that this is something that is going to take place, right? Because I mean, this works also for Fidesz, right, in Hungary, or the same with how is it called, United Russia, right, in the Russian Federation. I mean, well, in Russia it's obvious is of course different because it was clear from the very beginning, because everything depends on the president himself, right? Not on the party, not on the party level. But at the same time, you have these kind of democratic countries where some forces come to power basically on a democratic premise, but then afterwards it appears that this is kind of an endless repetition of the same government. And to a certain extent, you can also enlarge this question into Germany, right? When you have Merkel in power on and again and again. So somehow you cannot even judge that from this point of view, that if you have the same prime minister or like a person in charge of that party, that then it seems that you would get this kind of non-democratic consequences. So what are the preemptive optics we have to keep in order to trace this trend?
So very good. We're just to say very difficult question, and I'm glad I have now 5 hours left to give you a preliminary answer. So you're of course right to implicitly point out that we're in a very different situation than some of the 20th century cases that often turn up in this discussion. I mean, there are very few parties out there today who would, in their programs, in any shape or form, announce anti-democratic intentions. directly. We're also not in the same world anymore where you would have had parties closely associated with militias, let's say, where it was very clear that, okay, the party might not officially endorse violence or do it, but it's very clear that they're effectively condoning and, you know, trying to create civil war-like situations. This is not really very typical of the early 21st century. Instead, as you pointed out, what is much more typical is what some of our colleagues would refer to as autocratic legalism. So especially if you have the votes, you basically, you know, create the laws that suit you, but you can always say, look, there was nothing violent. It was always done, you know, with perfectly legal means. If you don't quite have the votes, so this is the contrast between Hungary and Poland, between having a constitution-changing majority and not having it, as in Poland. It already looks much more brutal, you know, when you basically try to destroy, in this case, a constitutional tribunal. But there will still be an attempt to say, but look, you know, it was legal, or there was a way of getting from A to B that was procedurally correct, and so on. So this, on one level, does change some of the fundamental mechanics, at least of the traditional militant democracy framework. Because the traditional framework would have said, and you alluded to this in the question, that, you know, we need to take preemptive action. Before anything even happens, you know, we're going to basically stop them in their tracks. And in many cases today, that seems implausible. There was a, I think by now almost forgotten situation where this kind of applied. Remember Austria in the year 2000, where basically Jörg Haider's far-right party formed a coalition. And it wasn't the EU itself at that point, but many other EU countries which started to sanction Austria in, you know, more or less plausible ways. And one of the counter-arguments against these sanctions at the time was, look, nothing has actually happened yet. You know, can you point to any human rights violations in Austria that would sort of justify this kind of approach? At the same time, as I was trying to say in the talk, the situation we're now with regard to the supranational militant democracy model that effectively we have in place would say that, look, yes, some of these governments have come to power democratically, but precisely because they now have a certain track record, a supranational actor can sanction them in certain ways. We couldn't have done this before, but now that it's become very clear how basically autocratic legalism operates in, let's say, Hungary and Poland, now it's precisely a good moment to restrict fundamental political rights, such as through Article 7. Again, that you might say is a kind of judgment call. Again, an almost forgotten case is Italy under Berlusconi, where also many people said, look, you know, what's happening to media pluralism in Italy is not normal, is not compatible with, you know, European standards, European values, and so on. Now, of course, one can say, look, it was simply double standards. You know, if you're a relatively small Central European country, you're going to get sanctions. If you're Italy, you won't get sanctioned because it's a big founding member of the European Union. But if you don't want to be quite so cynical, you might say, well, look, there was still some plausible assumption that within Italy, this was somehow going to work itself out. And I think this was not a crazy thought at the time, given that, you know, courts remained relatively strong. There was a president, Napolitano, who played a role in kind of, you know, reining in Berlusconi. So in that sense, I think there is something to be said for a criterion which argues that, yes, there needs to be a track record. So it's not like Brussels comes after you simply on the basis of something totally abstract. There needs to be a track record. And at the same time, and this goes to the other part of your question, I think by now plenty of actors have learned their lesson about autocratic legalism, or also what you might call sort of phony or bad faith exercises in comparative constitutional law. So for a long time, which is to say a couple of years in the last decade, the Hungarian government and then later also the Polish government quite successfully said to people, look, you know, what can be wrong with what we're doing? Because the same thing is the case in Denmark, or, you know, some sort of, you know, fantastic Scandinavian democracy. Or in the Polish case, the argument is usually, look, why do you criticize us? Look how judges are appointed in Germany. There can't be anything wrong with this if other countries do it as well. But what eventually I think many actors realized was that, well, look, you need to look at this holistically and as a system. You can't do these sort of cherry-picked one-on-one comparison, because after all, there's a reason why we talk about political systems and not simply about, isolated institutions. And if you look more carefully how the institutions work together, what certain changes, mean on the whole, you do realize what the actual problems are. And I think, things are still very, very far from how they should be, in my humble opinion. But I think it's also true that there has been a learning process on the part of the European Commission, the Venice Commission, so the Commission of Jurists associated with the Council of Europe. I think already years ago basically said very clearly, you can't play this game. You cannot tell us that, oh, there can't be anything wrong with our new institution because we can pinpoint one example in another country that is completely above suspicion. We do need to take this more holistic kind of view, or to invoke an image that one of my colleagues, Kim Shapley, has always used. That's very graphic, but I think that kind of gets at the essence of the problem here. One needs to understand the logic of what she has called the Franken State. So remember that Frankenstein's monster is created from totally normal body parts, but you put the parts together in a particular way, and it's a monster. Now, I don't want to call any human beings monsters, but the point is, you can take normal parts of other democratic political systems and you put them together in a very clever way, and boom, you have something that actually ends up, being autocracy outright, or at least facilitating autocracy in certain ways. And that is something that can be criticized. That is something that can be pinpointed. So you can be very precise. You don't need to kind of invoke very abstract, vague, woolly European values and so on. You can really very clearly say, look, these changes essentially amount to a total reduction in political pluralism, or this amounts to basically changing your election system such that no other party can really win, or this amounts to a kind of shocking reduction in media pluralism such that people have no real chance anymore of being properly informed. Now, last thing, just for the record, since you also mentioned this, I think one can criticize Angela Merkel for many things, but you can't blame her for getting re-elected so many times. In other words, the fact that somebody gets re-elected, or the fact that somebody is, popular over time, is of course not a sign that a country is somehow on the way to autocracy. And I think, let's say, critics of Viktor Orban can perfectly concede that, yes, he has real support. It's not like, oh, one has to say that everything is invented or purely manipulated. No, it can be perfectly true that there are genuine, Fidesz supporters on the ground who say this is, absolutely the program that we want. But if at the same time there's plenty of evidence that, there's manipulation going on, there is, a shocking lack of people's opportunities to really get informed. This famous story about the opposition candidate having 5 minutes altogether on TV to tell people what he was about, as opposed to the governing party, which basically uses state resources all the time to push its line. These are structural issues you can point to. And again, this is not arbitrary. This is not about, abstract European values, which, nobody can really specify. And that's the kind of things one should talk about. And one can say all these things without denying that, be it PiS, be it Fidesz, or Janša in Slovenia, also have genuine support, because that's not what the debate is about.
Yeah, right. In this sense, I also think there is a kind of a dimension which I felt like it was missing in your talk, which is actually a geographical one. I perhaps wouldn't put it like in these terms of the difference between the West and the East, but like what you mentioned with regards to these ban of some range of parties in Ukraine recently. Let's also not forget that, I totally understand this issue. But let's also not forget that, you know, like, let's say in pretty often in the post-Soviet situation, it's basically not just of the recent times, but if you take the whole period of the last 30 years after the crash of the Soviet Union somehow, that all this so-called party system has been created in this sense pretty artificially. I mean that pretty often what we are dealing with here are not, they are just called the parties, right? But they are not really political parties stricto sensu. These are just kind of like labels or some nominations behind which you have basically the structures which are operating more like, I don't know, more like troll factories than parties in the usual political sense. So in that regard, it's also, I think, it's one of the problems that we have to sense here, because if you compare this situation, because I mean, of course, like from a general point of view, it's much more challenging to ban a party in a which is a kind of a structure in a traditional sense, because it already means that we are somehow approaching the situation too late, right? That these guys, that those like guys were like professional enough in order to set up the real party and got some support and also like presenting, at least pretending to present some real part of the population in some country. But so in this sense, it's like pretty easy, because if you ban some quasi-party, it's not a real challenge in terms of the response from the people itself, right? But I think that the more challenging is basically like what you also mentioned with regards to the US and the former president, the former US president, because in this sense, you know, if we are though of course it's also kind of an artificial figure in this, but at the same time, I think the problem is here that you basically have to approach something which has different type of origin, this kind of artificial creature, so-called party, like here in Ukraine. Because if you just approach this phenomenon absolutely anti-democratic, but still like separately from the political system or only within the Republican Party framework, then you somehow miss all these kind of environment that produced this phenomenon, for which I think the Democratic Party bears quite some responsibility, right? And if you just sort of eliminate this one phenomenon, you are missing the total picture, as if without this one particular phenomenon, the rest of the picture is totally fine, which in reality is, of course, not. And in this sense, I also have this problem here, as if, you know, because if we approach, like with regards to all these kind of principles of militant democracy, many of which I deeply share, but at the same time, it seems like in this situation that we are somehow in this kind of, you know, end of history situation, that what we've got is the best what we can, and that like what remains is only to defend this utopia of liberal democracy, whether it's workable or not. But we have just to eliminate these like disturbing phenomena which are not fit into this end of post-historic picture, right? And just to improve here and there. And for that matter, we are somehow depriving ourselves of thinking about some possible more progressive alternatives in that sense, right? So I think that you have to be like geographically and also institutionally. I think this is a very important question, because I think like if we leave these only to institutions who have to make improvements here and there, we are just somehow depoliticizing democracy as such. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a number of important points. So let me pick up the one about basically real parties and fake parties. This is something that obviously is sometimes hard to decide, what's real, what has real support, and so on. But it's not something that is completely beyond some form of regulation, which I understand can again sound very technocratic. We only need to kind of have the right laws and so on, but laws do make a difference. And I think at a very minimum, you want to make sure that parties are basically autonomous. So they're not, just the instrument of a particular oligarch. I don't need to give you lectures about, Ukraine in this regard. But again, if one thinks back to Berlusconi, for instance, again, to not make it such a sort of, in the West, everything is great and only you have these problems. I mean, this was basically a totally artificial party created by Berlusconi's marketing department on the basis of how football fan clubs work. And one doesn't need to be a total cynic to think that, well, one of the main purposes was to keep Berlusconi out of prison, for as long as possible. So one wants to make sure that parties are really parties. Two ways of doing that concretely is that, well, you need absolute transparency about finances. That's not everywhere the case. And secondly, you do need to demonstrate an actual democratic, pluralistic life within a political party. So there are sort of egregious examples of literally one-man parties. I mean, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands is an example of this. I mean, his party literally, well, it has two members. One is Wilders the person. The other one is a foundation of which you'll be entirely surprised to hear Geert Wilders is the only member. So that would be illegal in a number of countries, and I think for good reasons. And if you think you're a charismatic person, who wants to have a new party and change the world, that's of course completely fine. But one way of proving that is that you actually, mobilize people, and importantly, that you can also basically demonstrate your ability to play the democratic game properly by, as boring and as pedantic and pedestrian as all that might sound, by having discussions and debates within a party such that you will basically generate something like a legitimate opposition or a stance of critical loyalty within a party. I know that for some people this sounds, oh my God, I'm going to have to sit around in pubs all the time and, discuss, party politics. And I know who's going to win the debate, the person who is going to still be sitting in the pub at 3 a.m. because they have no children and no job to get up for in the morning. So this is, Oscar Wilde's famous point about the problem with socialism being that it takes too many evenings, So people know about these problems, granted. But if you don't have these sorts of processes, you're basically, to put it bluntly, you're basically on the road to January 6, 2021. Because if you look at the Republican Party, it's very clear that at a certain point, a stance that says I'm a Republican in good standing, and yet I'm a critic of Trump at the same time, basically became untenable. And if you have no critical loyalty, if you have no legitimate opposition within your own party, you have no means of restraining the leader, which is more or less what happened in this case. So this is something that one can do something about in terms of, party laws and making sure that at least there's a presumption that parties are really parties and not personality cults and not, the instruments of particular economic interests and so on and so forth. The other point is of course well taken, that what I kind of alluded to in the talk as a quasi-technocratic approach that says, oh, here's a problem, we'll deal with it from on high, we send in the police, jurists will outlaw the party, and problem solved. That's, of course, highly problematic. What I would add is simply that I'm not familiar with any real-world cases where people really think this way. I think in all the kind of actual party ban discussions I'm familiar with, people are highly sensitive to these contexts, and they don't say, oh, there's no real problem, it's just, three crazy fanatics who we have to take out of the political game. There's usually an attempt to sort of have a multi-pronged strategy where you say, look, we tried to address real issues on the ground. You might say this was, if anything, kind of overdone in the case of Trump. I mean, I'm caricaturing, but not entirely when I say that after 2016, no white man could have a meal in a Midwestern diner in peace and quiet, because there were going to be 10 journalists from the New York Times, 50 sociologists, and so on. Everybody say, oh, what's the real problem? We haven't paid enough attention to the heartland and so on. So I don't quite see anybody making this gesture of saying, oh, it's just the kind of, small problem and we fix it and everything else is great and will go on as before. Last point, you're right, of course, to say that on some level, if militant democracy becomes relevant, it's already too late in a certain way. At the same time, you might say, look, it might, under some conditions, simply be useful to have these tools. And again, I know this sounds very technocratic. It sounds like the EU, right? I mean, it's always a tool, an instrument, a mechanism. I mean, the very language kind of, shouts technocracy to people. But still, it might be useful to simply say, look, we're kind of prepared for the situation. And ideally, it never arises. But the very fact that people know that something is in place might make a difference. Or, as a footnote, a real-world example, so parts of the far-right party in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, they're under very close surveillance by what is essentially a kind of political police, which, one can find problematic for other reasons. But most people, I think, would conclude that it has actually changed their behavior, because they're aware that, if they basically keep saying things which are so obviously outright racist or engage in a certain type of historical revisionism, they're going to be in trouble in all kinds of ways. So again, you might say, well, that's not a lot. That's basically just making the case for the moral benefits of hypocrisy, because they still going to think these things anyway. They just all of a sudden don't say them quite so loud anymore. Nevertheless, it might eventually change people's behavior somewhat. And the very fact that they know there could be different sanctions out there might make a difference. And for 1 minute, maybe going back to our sort of more supranational discussion, of course, nobody ever thought that there needed to be any sort of provision for basically expelling a country from the EU. What a crazy idea. I mean, who would ever want to, put themselves in a position of having to be expelled? But the very fact that there isn't such a provision now, you might say has negative consequences, because on one level, plenty of actors know, look, yeah, maybe they will cut some of the money in the end, even though they might not really do that either, because, now with Poland, it's clear that, it's not really working in terms of a real check on the government's power. But still, there would be some sense that, look, we shouldn't go too far, because we could really end up in a situation where we don't want to be. So on one level, you might say it's a scandal that we have a situation where, even in the absolutely worst case, let's say a military coup in an EU country, you couldn't actually expel the member state. And that just seems not a good situation to face.
Because this kind of transnational level is especially what I am here interested in, because somehow it mirrors the very premise of the democracy idea, right? Which had been developed rather for the nation state framework rather than for the EU functioning. But also in this regard, I think also referring to the more current situation and in particular to the Russian Federation, because in a way, when you were speaking, I was also thinking whether we could think of the idea that what if we take this framework of militant democracy, that apart from applying this toolkit on the national level or within one given nation state, one country, whether we can apply it internationally. And also you use the word sanctions, right? And also that the EU is incapable, unfortunately, perhaps, to punish the states. But do you think this in general sounds like plausible and something that we have to take into account, like, and perhaps I also referring here to sanctions against Russia in this case, which obviously are not enough at this point to stop the war atrocities that they are committing here in Ukraine. So whether we could think of this militant democracy idea of really of an international scale. So and in the situation when like somehow in parallel to what you described, like party ban or person ban, right? That this can be also applicable on really international level, also from a juridical point of view. That if the country represented by the government or by the leading party breaks the law, it will be punished as such, no matter who is guilty inside, right? I mean, but as such. So I understand here that maybe this kind of criteria, because you also were like talking about criteria, and I was thinking what kind of criteria are really relevant in this regard, because maybe on the one hand, it seems somehow unjust that you are punishing anybody kind of on the basis of a sort of a passport holder, right? But on the other hand, we don't really have other criteria to take into account in order to approach the real problem which we face, right? So what kind of mechanism you think could be appropriate in such emergency situations like this one that we are having now?
So maybe just to again historically contextualize for 1 second, the whole idea of, in a sense, a supranational militant democracy is neither new nor is it a particular European phenomenon. I mean, you have the same mechanisms with, the Organization of American States, the African Union, and there have been cases where, basically after a coup, other states said, okay, we're gonna find a way of punishing you, expelling you. We're gonna make sure that this does have consequences at an international level, and it can be done. It has been done. In the European context, clearly, the system has weakened over time in terms of, are the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights actually implemented? In many countries, they're not. Then all of a sudden, the possible further sanctions you could think of are unfortunately not very effective. In some cases, unfortunately, also it's been clear that these institutions themselves can be captured. So there are many very unsavory stories about how Azerbaijan has basically been working on the European Council, the Council of Europe, to make sure that it gets more favorable judgments, succeeds in its attempts to convince the world that it is a proper democracy, and so on. So all these systems, have limits in how effective they are. They're all vulnerable in certain regards. But maybe on it's not really a more positive note. I know that if you invite somebody from the US, there should be something uplifting and positive at the end. I'm struggling, but you might say that, look, this is always going to be partly about, do other governments kind of think that they can, let's say, apply sanctions without this backfiring on them? So in the EU context, it's very clear that basically all these attempts to seriously put pressure on basically the Hungarian government and the Polish government, all these initiatives have died in the council. So among the other member state governments. And surely that is partly because of a fear that, if they go after them, they're going to go after us. They're going to find problems in Malta too. Do you think everything is okay in Romania? Whatever. I mean, so there's this fear that, this is going to get out of hand in terms of a tit for tat set of retaliations. So I think in many of these situations, unfortunately, the inclination will always be, if possible, not do anything, not rock the boat. And one way of countering that, as maybe naive and idealistic as it can sound, is if governments within their own country face significant public pressure. And that in turn, I'm not telling you anything remotely new, because this is partly the work that you do. This all depends on basically more robust transnational exchange of ideas and public spheres. it was very clear that for a long time, nothing really was happening with regard to Viktor Orban, because in many Southern European countries, Hungary just wasn't a thing that showed up in national discussions or was reported on in national newspapers. And that eventually changed. It changed somewhat. But if nobody inside the country says, look, our own government is not doing anything, is condoning this, is collaborating with this. I mean, it took many years before somebody within Germany, let's say, first said, look, Angela Merkel keeps warning us that, if Marine Le Pen is elected president of France, the sky will fall, it's the end of Europe, and so on, which may well be true. But at the same time, Merkel was basically condoning whatever Viktor Orban was doing, was very happy to basically go along with the wishes of the German car industry, which got great conditions and still got great conditions in Hungary. And as long as German public opinion didn't make an issue out of this, the same way that German public opinion for a long time, as you well know, of course, didn't really make much of an issue of Nord Stream 2 and so on. There were very few incentives to, go out on a limb and talk differently, let alone do anything. So I'm not telling you anything remotely new. I mean, it's obvious that unless citizens, start paying some attention, these things are very difficult. At the same time, the burden, of course, should not just be on individuals who have many other worries and concerns, but it's partly a question of structures. And as long as our structures for transnational exchange and really hearing about what's happening in other countries and so on are so underdeveloped as they are, it also has effects on the possible effectiveness of basically supranational sanctions regimes.
Yeah, and perhaps the last question, because our time is running out. I wanted to ask you, what's your take on Zeitenwende, right? I mean, like we heard this kind of proclamation and this of the so-called turning point, but also if we move a bit from militant democracy to a kind of militarized democracy. What do you think are those changes that await in front of Germany, like in the next months or years, as far as, of course, we can predict? But it's not only about prediction, but what's your feeling as a person who is very much also involved in the German context itself? So apart from this pumping into the German military expenditure, what will be really, what are these really turning points for Germany that will change it for good or for bad later on? What's your perception of this?
So I generally don't do predictions, especially not about the future, but I would, if I may, on a somewhat more analytical territory, say two things. One is that I think it is a caesura. It's not just rhetoric. At the same time, the very term Zeitenwende, which is very abstract, doesn't assign responsibility to any particular person or party or group, doesn't sort of invoke any sort of clear sense of agency, in my view, is somewhat problematic. I mean, as many viewers will remember, the East German Revolution was called Wende, and many people later on said it was a turn, but that seemed like an impersonal, abstract sort of almost Hegelian kind of world history is turning. And it would have been better, and many people said later on, to say, look, no, it was actual people on the streets who had the courage to do something. There was agency. It wasn't just some, we're all at the mercy of these structural, etc. So I think that's an issue that I think is potentially problematic. And secondly, it's very unclear in the public debate, as far as I can see, what the criteria are for this somehow being a success or being turned in the right way, or people kind of doing the right thing and really reading the historical moment correctly and drawing the right conclusions. So it undoubtedly on one level is a challenge to the underlying German economic model in the way that, for instance, the Euro crisis, even though people constantly talked about crisis, in many ways was not. It was the opposite. It was actually, in many ways, sort of a good thing. Perception was different. Of course, perception was, you know, we are giving all this money to lazy Greek people and so on. But it wasn't structurally, in many ways, it wasn't actually that much of a crisis. Whereas now, you might say it really is. It really is a much different challenge to, again, the German car industry. It's, you know, to German energy policies, to all kinds of really fundamental aspects of how the country works. And it's really hard to see a sort of comprehensive plan for how these structural changes could really be brought about. Now, I grant this is difficult. I think it would be, you know, really facile to say, oh, why haven't our politicians in 5 minutes come up with, you know, the right roadmap? All I'm flagging is, you know, it is a serious challenge. And if it's not quite clear what it means to respond to the challenge, it makes it more likely that there will be some temptation, at least, for instance, to say, oh, maybe let's kind of weaken the sanctions. We just can't do this anymore. In other words, there might be sort of, you know, as political scientists would put it, cleavages on new conflict lines of all of, I mean, it's pretty predictable, I think, that sooner or later the far right will start saying, look, you know, we just can't bear this. Why do German consumers have to suffer because of these abstract, you know, ideals that, you know, nobody really understands or cares for? But that's, for me, that's something that is a very open question at this point, whether, you know, there are going to be real conflict lines inside a number of large European countries, which might then also mean really political conflicts as we have not seen them before. I know this didn't really answer your question about predictions, but I hope it was halfway interesting anyway.
Yeah, thanks so much. So thank you again, dear professor, for joining us today, and thanks so much to Joanna Saran and to Dorian for technically assisting this talk, and to our audience. Have a nice evening. We see each other perhaps tomorrow at the same time. We will be talking about Ukrainian culture at war. Thanks so much again. See you tomorrow.